Hi, this is Mrs. Engel, and today we're going to be talking about the early Cold War years. So, immediately following World War II, the US and the USSR emerged as the two major superpowers, and their goal was to battle it out over total world domination. So, we're talking the US as a predominantly capitalistic country is going to square off against the USSR, which was a communist country, and they were going to never really directly fight each other, but indirectly fight each other by trying to amass as many nations that supported their economic system, the US meaning that we were in favor of maintaining and promoting capitalism, and the USSR, who was interested in maintaining and promoting communism. But immediately following the World War II, you have, of course, Harry Truman, who will inherit the presidency after the unexpected death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he was very determined to make a name for himself as a progressive Democrat. And so when FDR proposed his New Deal to help bring America out of the Great Depression, Truman had the Fair Deal. So unfortunately, though, America after World War II is going to transition into more of a conservative mindset. So a lot of his programs and policies that he promoted under his Fair Deal did not necessarily materialize. So, for example, he was the first president to propose the nationalization of healthcare, and that didn't really become a reality until well into the 21st century under the Obama administration. But one of the things that he was able to do was immediately following World War II, you have what is known as the GI Bill, which will provide a bunch of loans as well as educational grants to World War II veterans so that they can either use it to buy a home or to go to college or to build a business because of their important and service on behalf of the country during World War II. So, one of the things that many returning World War II veterans are going to do is they are going to get married and they are going to start to move into the suburbs and have a bunch of children in what becomes known as the baby boom. And this is a period of time from approximately 1945 to 1965 where one American was born literally every 10 seconds. So this baby boom is largely due to the uh, not only the fact that children are living until adulthood, and also, largely due to the fact that there are improvements with vaccinations, but also because of the fact that, um, you know, birth control wasn't necessarily something that was encouraged until about the 1960s. So a combination of no real birth control, and then you have penicillin plus the poliomyelitis vaccine that's going to contribute to a surge in excuse me, the amount of children that are going to survive well past early childhood. And so, where are all of these families going to move to? Many of them are going to move into the suburbs. And William Levitt is going to produce really cheap manufactured housing that is very, very affordable for a lot of returning veterans and their families. And so think in terms of kind of similar to the housing that is found predominantly in the neighborhoods in and around our school. All the homes look almost identical. You have two or three or four different types of models, and it makes it much easier and more efficient for builders to build a multitude of homes in a rather short period of time. So you're also going to see a lot of people moving away from the Rust Belt towards the Sun Belt. What is the Rust Belt? That refers to the manufacturing sector of the United States. So think in terms of where all the industries were found during the Gilded Age, let's say in the Northeast and the Midwest. People are going to start moving further south as well as further west into California as well. And in addition to that, you are going to have Of course, Americans are going to be in a more conservative mindset, so they're not going to really embrace all of Truman's plans, especially like his progressive era or his very, very progressively minded, I would say, plans to nationalize healthcare as well as to uh, expand um, equality for, or at least expand or improve equality for African Americans. But one of the things that will help, like I said, contribute to the baby boom is the fact that penicillin is widely available, and also because of the fact that doctors like Dr. Joe Salk will create a vaccine that will cure polio, which is a very common childhood illness that rendered a lot of children um, unable to make it to adulthood, or it left them severely deformed, like what happened to poor President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who contracted polio and then was not able to use his legs for the remainder of his life. But unfortunately, because Americans are more in a conservative mindset, you're going to see the decline of unions. And so, you are going to also see Harry Truman, even though most Americans are not quite there yet to in favor of integration, he will issue Executive Order 9981, which will integrate the U.S. military. Prior to 1948, African Americans had to serve in segregated units from white troops. Well, after this executive order, that is no longer the case. Now, African Americans can serve alongside white soldiers whenever it is necessary for them to go into combat. And very it was very, very unpopular, I'm going to say, this executive order in the South, so much so that a group of Southern Democrats are going to splinter away from the Democratic Party and form their own independent party and challenge Truman for the uh, Democratic nomination in 1948. When they're unsuccessfully able to wrestle a Democratic nomination from him in 1948, they form the Dixiecrat Party, and it is seen as a means to, undermine his support amongst Southern Democrats, because this particular party was pro-segregation and opposed to his executive order. But Truman was a fighter, and so he, even though it was assumed that he wouldn't win his own presidential election, because remember, he ascended to the presidency after the unexpected death of FDR, uh, most people just assumed that he would not get elected to another term, but he ends up winning re-election in 1948. In fact, the Chicago Daily Tribune anticipated that the Republican candidate, George Dewey, would defeat Truman. So this is a very, very famous picture of him smiling and holding this headline, because when the election results came in, it was actually Truman that uh, won his attempt to be reelected to a full term of his own. But like I said, his program to expand the or increase the minimum wage, as well as to establish the nationalization of health insurance, as well as promote civil rights. He wanted to abolish the poll tax. He wanted to see improvements in education, as well as he supported the creation of a federal anti-lynching law. None of this happened, largely because most Americans are not in a liberal mindset. They have transitioned into more of a conservative mindset, which happens throughout U.S. history, where um, every so often, like the 1920s, were very conservative, the 1930s were very liberal, the 40s and 50s will be conservative, the 60s and early 70s will be pretty liberal, and then the 80s and 90s were very, very conservative eras as well. So, the U.S. flip-flops back and forth between um, trending one way versus the other, leaning more conservative or more Republican or more liberal in many different instances. So, one of the things that Truman's going to have to deal with foreign policy wise is the Cold War. This is a period of hostility between the US and the USSR, even though the Soviet Union didn't necessarily fight the US directly. We indirectly fought each other through a series of conflicts known as the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Why? Because the United States was determined to contain communism because it regarded communism kind of like a cancer that was spreading across the globe. And so the idea was to stop it from spreading and to go into countries like uh, North Korea as well as Vietnam to try and prevent it from falling under communist control. And that didn't necessarily work out too well for us. But immediately following World War II, just the US and the USSR were the two main countries that uh, were predominantly, globally dominant. And that's largely because the economy of England, as well as like physically the country of England, as well as France and Germany, were completely ravaged by the effects of two very, very devastating world wars. And immediately following World War II, even though the USSR suffered an extensive amount of casualties, you're going to see the US and the USSR actively competing on a global scale for to see which economic system is going to dominate across the globe. Capitalism is the predominant economic system in which the United States and most countries today embrace, in the sense that the people in an individual country get the freedom to choose what goods and services they're going to produce or consume. Whereas in the USSR, even though it's not entirely like communist as far as what Karl Marx had envisioned, ultimately, the USSR was an example of a totalitarian state. It had direct control over everything that the government did, as well as what its individual people owned and consumed on a daily basis. So there was no freedom of choice. The government held all of the power. So Americans were very, very afraid of communism because they didn't really understand it. It's very difficult to understand in general even today. But realistically, what you need to know is that less than 1/10 of 1% of Americans are actually communists. And it was more of an imagined fear than a realistic one, but it was one that uh, was very, very worrisome on the minds of many Americans. So, even though we were friends and allies during World War II, immediately after World War II, our relationships soured. One of the reasons why is because immediately following to what's going to happen is that based on the directions in which each of the countries went, uh, in order to make it, there was a race to Berlin first. And so you're going to have the US and Great Britain pushing, for example, from the west eastward, and then the Russians or the Soviets are going to be going from the east westward. And uh, wherever the Russian military overpowered or took control of, it just kept its military influence over even after World War II ended. And so, when the US and Great Britain pulled out of Western Europe, the Soviets did not. Instead, they decided to create, largely because of they had been very negatively affected by two major world wars. Lost 20 million people in World War One, and then another 20 million in World War II. So Stalin created what was known as satellite countries or satellite nations, which means that all of the countries that the Soviets militarily occupied during World War II became communist countries. And these communist countries served as a buffer or satellite nations in order to protect the Soviet Union in the event that there was another major world war, like a World War III. And this really upset not only FDR, but also Harry Truman. But when they got together at the Yalta Conference, that was the thing that was furthest from their mind. Even though FDR pressed Stalin to offer democratic elections in some of the countries that he had militarily occupied during the war was not quite over yet, and there was not enough information provided to Stalin about the atomic bomb, which there was a lot of hurt feelings over. But FDR shared with our close friends, Great Britain, that we had this new technology, that the war would probably end rather quickly. Immediately following World War II, all of the countries involved in that conflict agreed that there needed to be the creation of the United Nations as an international peacekeeping organization dedicated to helping promote not only human rights but also world peace. You could say that, they were successfully able to stop a World War III, but have they been able to prevent war from breaking out worldwide? Absolutely not. I don't think you can absolutely do that. But ultimately, the relationship between the U.S. and the USSR really broke down, largely not at the Yalta Conference, but definitely at the Potsdam Conference. And the reason why is because the players are going to change. You have Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister of England, FDR, which was President of the United States, and then Joseph Stalin was the constant in February 1945. And the only thing that they really were able to collectively agree on was the need for the creation of the United Nations, which was done and is still an important organization that functions today. But at the Potsdam Conference, you're going to have uh, three entirely or two out of the three players are going to be entirely different. You're going to have Clement Attlee, who will be the Prime Minister of England, replacing Winston Churchill, and then Harry Truman will ascend to the presidency after the unexpected death of FDR. And so, Truman and Stalin don't get along at all, and Truman had no problem pressing Stalin for democratic elections to take place in the eastern satellite nations he had control over. Unfortunately, relationships did sour, and even though all of these countries were very proactively involved in the United Nations, including the UN Security Council, there was a lot of animosity over the fact that we kept secret from the Soviet Union our Manhattan Project, our atomic bomb. And another reason why there was so much animosity is because of the fact that what was left over of Germany was divided up into four different zones. You had the zone controlled by the British, a zone controlled by the French, and then the US. And then because the Soviets made it to Berlin first, their zone of influence or control is going to be communist, but the city itself of Berlin is, even though it's located in the heart of Soviet occupied territory, is going to be divided. And then eventually, because the US, France, and Great Britain all are capitalistic countries, they're going to consolidate their efforts into one nation versus like a smaller chunk that is predominantly communist. So that'll be another source of tension between the two. And then the city of Berlin itself will also remain divided as well. But unfortunately, um, there will be an iron curtain that will descend over half of Europe. That's because there weren't democratic elections allowed in the eastern Soviet satellite countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, Romania. All of those different countries, as well as eastern Germany, remain communist. And what infuriated the United States is that as well as other countries like England and France, is that capitalism wasn't even considered allowable in those regions. And so, one of the ways in which they battled each other was economically through providing assistance to each of the different countries that were affected by World War II. And one of the things that also didn't help out the situation is the cantankerous relationship between Truman and also Joseph Stalin. Truman had no problem telling Joseph Stalin to go to hell, which was not something that most people lived to, tell the tale of if they, ended up encountering Stalin. So as far as, and then Truman made it his mission to try and contain communism before it spread like a cancer and infected countries all over the globe. Why did he want to do this? Because of an article written by George F. Kennedy. It was known as Article X, and it's really X. It's not like Roman numeral 10. He was like a U.S. diplomat that lived in the Soviet Union for a period of time, and he saw firsthand the horrors of Stalin. I would have to say that Stalin is ranks right up there with Hitler as being one of the, most evil and ruthless dictators of the 20th century. Hitler gets, of course, a terrible reputation for murdering a whole bunch of his own people or anybody who was opposed to his regime, as well as, um, 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. But Stalin murdered about 20 million of his own people, anybody who was opposed to his methods or his style of rule, which was not good either. But President Truman, is going to be unique because of his very, very, you know, bold and brash and no nonsense personality. Both gentlemen are going to clash big time. But the Truman Doctrine is going to be his uh, assertion that there is a need to provide economic and military aid to countries that he felt as though were threatened by communism. Because, like I said, communism is like a cancer that's spreading across the globe. His goal was to contain communism before it metastasized and grew and infected countries all across the world. And so his way in which he is going to try and um, amass a bunch of support for capitalism is to buy their support. How is he going to do that? Well, in countries like Greece and also Turkey that were very much so fragile after World War II, he's going to pump about $400 million in aid, like financial aid to Greece and Turkey, to keep it from turning into a communist country. So that's a lot of money that is spent period for that time period, let alone into and for another country to ensure that it remains capitalistic and not communist. Another way in which he is going to try and stick it to the Soviets and is basically through the Marshall Plan. This was a $17 billion economic aid program to the countries of Western Europe only. What this ultimately did is help rebuild the economies as well as the infrastructure of Western Europe that was ravaged from World War II. Did he offer this money to the countries of Eastern Europe? Absolutely not, largely because why would he? Because ultimately those countries were communist and he didn't want to necessarily promote that. So that's going to be another instance in which the US and USSR are going to be at odds with one another. Another thing that's going to be a problem is what is known as the Berlin crisis. When the US, France, and England consolidated their zones of influence, that's going to really infuriate Stalin. So, in what is considered to be the portion, the Federal Republic of Germany or Western Germany, all of the English, the French, and the U.S. zones of occupation will unite because they're all capitalist to form one country in 1949, and then they're going to unite their zones of influence in the city of Berlin itself. Well, in order to get to the city of Berlin, the U.S. or the French or the British had to travel through Soviet-controlled territory in communist Eastern Germany. And so what Stalin did is impose a blockade. He refused to let uh, Western European or even American goods and services go across the border in order to provide resources and services to the inhabitants living in the capitalist portion of West Berlin. And this became known as the Berlin Crisis. And so, in response, you have the Berlin Airlift, which is also known as Operation Vittles, where for almost a year, there's going to be various planes that will fly over over Western Berlin and drop food and supplies and materials to the people there who are denied access to capitalistic resources in Western Europe. So eventually, Stalin will cave and allow the capitalist forces in Western Europe access um, to Western Berlin, but this particular issue will prompt the countries in the North Atlantic that are capitalist, meaning the US, Canada, Great Britain, France, and pretty much all of the Western European countries to form what is known as NATO. It stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this organization was a military alliance, and the whole purpose of it was in the event that the Soviet Union decided to invade the capitalist portion of Western Europe to try and uh, turn it communist. This would be a unnecessary red line and lead to the emergence of World War III. So all of these countries that were part of the NATO had a military alliance. An attack against one would be an attack against them all. And this is the first time that we actually, even though we got involved in World War I and World War II, we never really formally joined or were a part of a a treaty agreement, meaning forcing us to have an alliance with these other countries. We were allied um, with Great Britain and France, but we didn't have or sign a formal agreement recognizing our promise to go to war if necessary to protect their interests. So this is the first time that this actually happens, and this is something that George Washington warned against in his farewell address in 1796, and this is the first time in U.S. history that we break with tradition and actually form a international alliance with Europe. And so, in response to this, the Soviets are going to form their own military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact. It'll consist of, of course, the USSR and then all of its eastern satellite countries. And in the event that World War III happens, all those countries are going to come to the aid of the USSR. So the battle lines are drawn in the event that there is a World War III. All the players have already been pre-established. So in response to all this, you're going to see a need to beef up, uh, foreign intelligence, and that's why the CIA is created, and the National Security Council is also created as a means to advise the president as well as to spy on other countries in order to ensure that we are ready in the event that troops are being moved or there's a potential for World War III. So these are all the countries that are part of NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So why is it called NATO? Because all these countries are located in the northern portion of the Atlantic Ocean. And all of these countries are capitalistic. And the whole point is to safeguard themselves against attack if the USSR decides to invade capitalistic Western Europe. And then the Warsaw Pact consisted of the USSR, of course, and all of its Eastern European satellite countries like Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Eastern Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and in the event that the uh, NATO alliance invaded communist controlled territories, it would cause the emergence of World War III. So, like I said, the battle lines are drawn, the Iron Curtain has descended over half of Europe, and so uh, half of Europe is communist in the wake of World War II, and the other half is capitalist. And this will be a major source of contention between the US and the USSR from 1945 to 1991. What makes this particular Cold War even scarier is when the Soviet Union actually develops its own uh, atomic bomb. And this is going to be the beginning of the nuclear arms race. So even though we detonated the first and developed the technology first for the creation of an atomic bomb, um, it was not too long thereafter that the Soviet Union detonated their own atomic bomb, just a few short years after we developed the technology. They did so in 1949, and then we developed our own hydrogen bomb, which is even more powerful than the atom bomb. And as a result, the Soviets are right on our heels and end up developing their own hydrogen bomb in 1953. So, the U.S. scientists are supposed to keep all this technology a secret, but somehow information is leaking from one side to the other, and that will be a major source of contention between each of the individual countries. So, another thing that is really uncertain, and one of the reasons why the Cold War expands into Asia, is because a lot of the Asian countries were utilized and exploited and became colonies of European countries. So, one of the things that happened, especially in China, for example, each country carved up its own sphere of influence and control. So, after World War II happens, and you have various colonies that are going to be unstable, especially when a strong country like, England or France that used to have control over a certain region of or portion of this world no longer have the same, military might. Take for example Japan. They pretty much control just about almost like a huge chunk of Asia as well as what is considered to be Southeast Asia. And after World War II, they're severely weakened. And so, one by one, you're going to see a lot of these individual countries seek their independence. Case in point with the Philippines, but also there is civil war that breaks out in China. There are the Chinese nationalists that are not really very democratic are going to square off against the communist forces under Mao Zedong. Uh, Over $2 billion worth of military aid is funneled into China to ensure that it doesn't fall under communist control. It really becomes, effortless and not worth all the money because China does end up falling under communist control in 1949. And who is blamed for it? It's Truman, even though it's not necessarily his fault. But he did funnel billions of dollars into the Jiangxi side, the side of the Chinese nationalists and not the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong. And it was, a waste of money because it didn't necessarily work out in his favor. So, China was a loss, and now not only is the largest country in geographically in Asia communist, the USSR, but now the largest country, like population wise, in Asia, China is now communist. In addition to a huge chunk of Eastern Europe. Then came the battle over Korea. Korea itself, north of the 38th parallel, was communist due to the Soviet influence not too far from that particular country. South of it was under the under capitalist control. And so when the communists of North Korea invaded the democratic South Korea, the South Koreans appealed to the UN for support. And so the UN forces that were sent in the Korean War, 90% of them were US forces. And Truman appointed General Douglas MacArthur as commander of the UN forces during the Korean War. So the Korean War is actually a civil war, an internal conflict that we get involved in because we're concerned about another country falling under communist control. Because had it been up to Kim Il sung, who is the grandfather of Kim Jong un, he would have loved to have united all of Korea under communist control. And Sigmund Rhee petitioned the UN for support uh, in order to maintain South Korea and to ensure it remains a capitalistic country. But the concern was that if another nation fell under communist control, then what would stop all the other countries in southeastern Asia from falling under communist control as well? So that's like the domino theory, is what that is. So what's going to happen is that at first in 1953, you're going to have the communist Koreans invade capitalistic South Korea and push the South Koreans all the way down to the Pusan perimeter right here. And so, under General Douglas MacArthur, he's going to orchestrate an amphibious landing at the Incheon perimeter and then be able to push the North Korean forces across the 38th parallel, which is the dividing line between North and South Korea, back into North Korean territory. But instead of stopping there, he continues to push too close to Communist China, and Communist China warns if you get close enough to the Yalu River, we're going to intervene in the conflict. So they do. They join in on behalf of the side of North Korea, and they're, from 1950 to 53, Communist China and Communist North Korea are battling capitalistic South Korea, and then the UN forces, largely led by the US, 90% of them, over control, and it was pretty much a stalemate. And when an armistice was signed in 1953, the 38th parallel serves as a dividing line between uh, communist North Korea and capitalist South Korea. And it's still considered the dividing line between the two countries, even to this day. So, unfortunately, you could say that Korea was also another Truman failure. Why? Because uh, it was not, well, or you could say it's a success. It depends on how you look at it. Most people look at it as a frustrating stalemate because the war started along the 38th parallel and then ended along the 38th parallel, and there really wasn't any territory gained or lost overall. So, really, all the money that was funneled into Korea, as well as in China, wasn't necessarily, was it worth it? That's still kind of debatable. But more importantly, General Douglas MacArthur, his solution is, why don't we drop a bomb, like the atomic bomb, or actually at this particular point in time, the hydrogen bomb on China. Let's nuke China. But Truman refused to do so, and the reason why is because the U.S. is not the only country that has the atomic bomb. His concern is that if we nuke China, even though they don't have the atomic bomb yet, or at least that technology, the concern is, well, the USSR does, so what's to stop them from dropping atomic bombs on the US? So Truman says, no, we're not going to do this. And because General MacArthur tries to take the issue to the American people, Truman fires him. And then, because General Douglas MacArthur is considered to be a war hero since he so bravely served in World War II as well as in the Korean conflict, people were really stunned and shocked and upset over this. And so, Truman could have run for another term, but ended up not running at all in 1952. Because he is just so unpopular due to the frustrating stalemate that was the Korean War, the fact that communist China, or China falls under communist control, and also because he fires a very, very popular war hero. So, overall, the Korean War cost $100 billion, whereas about 2 million was funneled into China. So lots, or sorry, 2 billion was funneled into China. So billions of dollars have now been spent globally trying to contain communism. And did it really work? Not necessarily, not as well as people would think, but it didn't necessarily stop Americans from being very much so proactively concerned about the concern that communism could infiltrate the United States, even though it was more of a imagined fear than a realistic one. Um, People were very, very much so concerned, and there were a series of laws that were passed making it illegal to talk about overthrowing the government or to proactively support communism. And then members of the Communist Party were jailed. Also, the McCarran Internal Security Act made it so that communist organizations had to register with the federal government. The House Un-American Activities Committee, or the HUAC, was responsible for investigating the Hollywood industry as well as other subversive actions of communists in the United States to make sure that communism didn't infect our country. And this is a very, very famous political cartoon of the HUAC where they basically didn't care who they ran over as long as they could continue to promote the idea that they were trying to um, prevent communism from spreading throughout the United States. So, why did they target Hollywood? Because Hollywood was predominantly liberal, and when more than 500 actors and directors refused to testify before the HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Commission, they were blacklisted. Nobody was willing to hire them. So people like Humphrey Bogart, who was a very, very famous actor, didn't get a job after this. And other people's reputations were ruined largely because of this fear, the second Red Scare, this fear of communists spreading throughout the U.S., even though it's more of an imagined fear than a realistic one. In addition to that, you're going to have people unwilling to speak out and criticize communism for fear that they'd be accused of being soft on communism. So Arthur Miller is going to write the Crucible, which is actually set during the 1690s and is all about the Salem witchcraft trials. But realistically, like he's writing this in the 50s because he's not really allowed to come out and criticize communism. But it's all about the Salem witchcraft trials is that crazy witch hunt, and how people were accused of witchcraft for no good reason. This is in reaction to the communist witch hunt that actually like plays out in the United States due to the fear of communist infiltration, even though it's not really a realistic fear. Why does all this communist fear really stir up? It's largely because of the concern over who was responsible for trading atomic secrets with the USSR because they didn't necessarily like develop that technology that led them to create the atomic bomb and then the hydrogen bomb by accident. It was alleged at the time that Alger Hiss, who was a well-connected political associate of FDR. He was present at the Yalta Conference, and it was alleged that he passed secret information to the Soviets about the existence of an atomic bomb. And once the USSR collapsed in 1991, we now know that that was absolutely 100% correct. That Alger Hiss did pass very, very like secretive intelligence information about the atomic bomb to the Soviets, and so he was really legit, guilty of spying for the Soviet Union. And then information came to light uh, that Klaus Fuchs, as well as Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who actually like were scientists that worked on the Manhattan Project, they gave the Soviets the recipe, the combination necessary to develop the atomic bomb because you need a certain percentage of uranium and plutonium in order to uh, create an atomic bomb. And so the Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were tried and actually electrocuted, face death by electrocution for selling atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. And so, in response to all of these cases that materialized in the late 40s and early 50s, Harry Truman will issue an Executive Order 9835, which um, forced all federal employees to remain or to profess their loyalty to the U.S. government, or at least, gave the government the right to investigate this. So this is Alger Hiss, who was totally guilty of giving the USSR information about the existence of the atomic bomb, and then Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were the scientists that worked on the atomic bomb when it was first developed, and then they sold the information on what potential combinations of uranium and plutonium were necessary to create it. And this is Senator Joseph McCarthy, who built a reputation out of accusing people of being communists. So Senator Joseph McCarthy is going to be a senator, like a unknown senator from Wisconsin, who's going to gain a bunch of fame and notoriety when he gave a speech in Wheeling, Virginia, when he said he had in his hand a list of 200 known communists working for the State Department, meaning working for the US government. And he was really full of crap. He did not have a list of 200 people that were working for the US government that were communists. He just did this in order to get reelected because it wasn't entirely certain that he would get elected to another term as senator. But his accusation will draw a lot of attention. And so when he does get elected, he is going to be given his own committee. He's the chairman of a special Senate committee that held hearings to try and um, find these communist people that he accused of being part of in working for the US government. And this became known as a communist witch hunt, largely because he ruined the reputation of dozens of people, mainly like minority groups, and then he started accusing members of the US military of being affiliated with communism without any sufficient evidence to prove that there was. that they were connected to communism in any way. So he was just, ruining people's reputations in order to, you know, continue to, keep up appearances and maintain the lie that he originally told. And he was able to keep up this charade for 4 years until he ended up dying a broken man and he was expelled from the Senate for making accusations against people without proper justification. So, the second Red Scare is very, very similar to the first Red Scare that emerged in the late teens, early 1920s. It was more of this is a fear of communism, and it was more of an imagined fear than a realistic fear. And the term McCarthyism was a word that was created from his last name to describe when a politician tried to personally assassinate the character of another individual. So without any real proof that they were linked to communism. So he was responsible for ruining a lot of people's careers, and journalists and other, higher ups in Washington were very, very reluctant to speak out against him for fear of being accused of being soft on communism as well. So, but even though he ends up getting censured for his actions and is expelled from the Senate when it's becomes apparent that he is full of crap and he doesn't necessarily know what he's talking about, doesn't necessarily cause Americans not to worry about communism. And it's going to be a fear that will continue to resonate with Americans until communism is no longer, and the Cold War is no longer an issue when communism ends in the Soviet Union, and its hold or stronghold over Eastern Europe collapses in the late 80s and early 90s. This is a copy of that, telegram or that he wired to the White House after his speech saying he had known. At first it was 200 and then it became 57. I mean, the numbers changed all the time. So he was someone who was just making up lies to get elected, but these lies ended up destroying people's reputations. So that, in short, is the beginning of the Cold War. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk about the next set of notes in a little while. Until then.